Hey, peace and blessings, family. My name is Adam Jackson, and I am the Chief Executive Officer for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. And I want to welcome you here this evening, the Black Power Media family, to come on in and join us for a very important conversation about the 2022 election, the 2022 midterms. And, I'm going to be joined very soon by Brother Lawrence Grandpre, who is the Director of Research for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. And before I bring him on, I know that a lot of folks here at the Black Power Media family are very familiar with the Search of Black Power podcast and show. And so I want to give you the opportunity to come on in tonight. It's going to be a special edition of the show. Usually our shows are pre-recorded, but tonight's show is actually live. And so we're going to be doing it live. Lawrence will be giving a presentation live about the 2022 midterms and just talking about the implications for the Black community and just talking generally about what these things means moving forward for us in the electoral process. And I also want to give you an opportunity to become a supporter of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. We're really happy that Brother Jared Ball and all the founders, co-founders at Black Power Media have allowed us to use this platform to talk about our work in Baltimore. But in case you are unfamiliar about the work that we do, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, we're a grassroots political organization, or more specifically, a think tank located here in Baltimore City, and we advocate for legislation and policies that benefit the Black community. And so if you've been watching In Search of Black Power at all over the past, 3, 4, 5 months, then you should be very familiar by now with Lawrence and a lot of the work that he's been doing as our Director of Research. And so tonight's conversation, again, is going to focus on the midterm elections. And if you want to support this work, if you want to support LBS producing this kind of knowledge for our community, then I highly encourage you to become a sustainer. At the bottom of your screen right here, you'll see a ticker that says fund the fight and become a sustainer. You can go to lbsbaltimore.com/sustain and become a sustainer immediately. But yeah, enough of me talking. I want to get right into the conversation. Last thing I want to mention is that there will be a Q&A section at the end. So if you are a person who wants to be engaged in tonight's conversation, you are in for a very special treat because Lawrence will be taking questions at the end about the presentation on the 2022 midterms. And so we're really excited to be here tonight. Thank you so much. I'm going to get out your way and bring on my good brother, Lawrence Grandpre. Lawrence, what's popping, son?
Hey, can you see me?
Yes, sir.
All right, great. So I'm doing well. Thank you all for checking in. Hopefully, folks can check us live or come in over the next couple of days on YouTube. But 2022, I gave a talk on the elections 2020 that I felt wanted to do it a little bit after the November elections because it takes time to engage the data. And honestly, exit poll data isn't that great. So I wanted to wait till after the Georgia runoff. And this is not going to be like there's going to be some math, going to be some numbers, but it's going to be more in terms of analysis, in terms of understanding what happened, engaging some of the things that appear counterintuitive and going over politically what this might mean for the Black community. So is the screen share up, Adam? Is the screen up?
Yes, sir, it is.
Okay, great. So I got a few slides here. Hopefully it'll be not too dense, but there's just going to be some maps, and I want to give you some visuals of some of the actual turnout data and begin to analyze this from the perspective of what it means to our community. So let's just set the scene. So as we know, Democrats controlled the presidency in 2020. They controlled the House of Representatives by a slim margin, and they were literally tied in the Senate, but because tie goes to the party with the White House, Kamala Harris, of course, is breaking the ties. The Democrats controlled all three houses in America, federal government. This typically leads to a massive shellacking, a big defeat, as people desire what they call mixed government, or sort of not having one party control of government. And so when this happens, usually, even if it's not mixed government or it's not total unified control, the party of the president, 2 years after the president wins, they get really beaten down in the midterm election. So you can see here, Clinton lost 60 seats, Obama lost 70 seats, including multiple senators' seats. Those are the bluish bars. The brownish, purplish bars are the actual House of Representative seats. So this was the expectation. The expectation was inflation is going through the roof. We have unified control of government. The out party during midterm years always does well. what we had was the Democrats really confounding expectations. You can see here in the seats that are toss-ups, the majority of them actually went Democrat. You can see the Democrats even won a few, leans GOP, just in terms of the pre-race expected result. So this is obviously a result of political polling. The political polling was showing a so-called red tsunami. The Republicans were doing very well in preliminary Republican polling. The theory now is that Republicans actually they paid a ton of their friendly pollsters to basically cook the books and put in a bunch of polls that were leaning towards Republicans, and that skewed the averages of a lot of these polls. I mean, of course, it's diverse, but basically the Democrats are framing this as a huge victory. This is a stunning upset, even though, of course, the Democrats ended up losing control of the House, as we know now. They lost it by such a slim margin and so much less than expected. The Democratic Party leadership is kind of like doing a victory lap, claiming this to be a historic defeat of expected results. And that's the House. Now we go to the Senate. As we can see, this was before the Warnock runoff. But this actually includes the Warnock runoff, excuse me. So this is actually after just last week, Warnock, the incumbent African-American pastor of Ebenezer Baptist, incumbent senator, defeated, of course, Herschel Walker. I mean, I was going to talk more about this race, but I feel like this race has been talked about to death. So I'm actually not going to talk nearly as much about it because it's over. Warnock has won. He has gotten the more than 50% majority needed to satisfy the electoral needs of Georgia, and the Democrats will actually increase their margin in the Senate from 50 to 51. This is important because when you have 50 seats, it's a tie, and Kamala Harris can break the tie. But it's still a divided Senate. It's not a Democratic leadership Senate. So the committees in the Senate were actually 50-50 Republican-Democrat, which made it very hard for the Democrats to push anything through a committee. But what's 51 seats, I mean, as many of you probably know, the Democrats will actually be able to have the majority on every committee. So that means they can push more things through the Senate. So this was being sold to us as a historic victory, defeating expectations, gaining a seat in the Senate despite having unified control of government. Again, the Democrats are doing a victory lap. I actually kind of wanted to go into the data and begin to understand what actually happened. And this is not a surprise, though the Democrats are claiming this is a historic victory and historic defeat for Republicans. Republicans actually won the popular vote. I just want to show you the number because the way people talk about it, you think they didn't. You know what I mean? So the Republicans actually won the popular vote by, right here, close to 3 million. The Republicans now looks like they're going to have about 218, 219. I think that's actually, I think a House of Representatives member actually died, so there may be another runoff coming up. So the Republicans will have a very, very, very slim majority in the House, and they won the popular vote. And again, this is one thing I really wanted to show, and it's going to be important later. Turnout was actually down compared to 2018. But as you can see here, 2018 was actually a historic high in terms of midterm election turnout. So as much as people talked about, Black people showed up and saved democracy, the abortion vote, turnout was actually down compared to 2018 before Roe v. Wade. So this is important. We don't want to just accept even a week out, because that's why I tend to wait to do these talks. Even a week out, you hear it was a massive turnout for Roe v. Wade, or energized the base. And that may be true, maybe selectively true in certain key, absolutely critical demographic areas. But on balance, turnout was down. But that's really because in terms of modern history, as you can see, going back to 1974, turnout plummets when it comes to midterm elections in 74. And ever since then, the typical American turnout in the midterm election has been around 38 to 42%. But starting in 2018, we bumped up to 50%, a number we have not seen since really the 60s. And so we stayed around those historical highs in the 2022 election, but it was still down compared to, you remember how it was, all the Trump hysteria, the absolute Women's March, the, shithole countries, the Trump just kind of constantly sticking his foot in his mouth when he was in office led to a massive turnout in 2018. So it was down, but it was still extremely high. And in terms of interpreting what this data actually means, that's going to be important. Okay, so just again, showing you some of these exit poll numbers. Again, not the biggest fan of exit polls, but this is important. As you can see here, this was a battle of the economy versus abortion. So as you can see, the very, very small percent of America that thought the economy was doing excellent or good, they went almost 90% to the Democrats. This is self-selection bias, where typically people in their own party have a rosy picture of their party because it's working for them. But 76% of Americans said the economy was not good or poor, and they went 62% for Republicans. So you could also read this as a relatively small sliver of people who are doing well want to keep the status quo, want to keep stability. But the people who are not doing great, even though Republicans had no plan to deal with inflation, we all know that. They were angry. They said everything's too expensive. We don't know what the Democrats are doing. Well, at least try the Republicans, at least 60% of them. But as you can see, if you go down to the bottom of the graphic, when you go to the abortion conversation, it's a bit different. When you combine people who are legal in all cases and legal in most cases, that's 59% of Americans. That's a solid majority of Americans. And they went overwhelmingly for the Democrats. So again, you have this issue that mobilizes the base of the Republican Party in incredible ways. So you can go to the end of the graphic. 88% of people said they wanted illegal in all cases voted for Republicans. I have no idea what that 11% is doing. But even if they say legal in most cases, that's still illegal in most cases. That's still 91% of the 26% of the sample size who said they want abortion illegal in most cases. 91% of them voted Republican. So this issue massively mobilizes, really a massive chunk of the Republican base, but it really turns off a lot of independents and what we realize now are suburban women who culturally and economically traditionally have been Republican. Many people have argued, and I believe truthfully, that this issue has polarized what has been a natural Republican demographic in terms of middle-class suburban, especially white women, and lead to some of the results that we saw. So let's continue to go into the data. So as you can see, as much as people talk about the shift in white women, or shift in whites voting for the Democrats lost white people. They always lose white people, but they're losing them less than they did in the past. Democrats always win people of color, but they're winning them less than they have in the past. And again, I think these are trends that we want to understand because, again, the theory is that, there's going to be this ascendant coalition of people of color, and they are instantaneously a demographic that will vote Democrat, especially when it comes to Latino and Hispanic. That is not the case. You can see year over year from 14 to 18 to 20 to 22, this percentage of the Latino vote has been declining precipitously for the Democrats. Now, some of that's just high turnout, young Latinos who otherwise wouldn't have turned out, turning out, trading crypto, listening to Joe Rogan, like those type of young folk, regardless of race, tend to be a little more conservative. They typically stay home. That's the nature of American politics. Those type of folks typically stay home. They're increasingly turning out and they're voting in heterodox ways. But the reality is that Democrats keep losing white people. They're losing them less, keep winning people of color, but they're winning them less. And as you can see, blacks are the most solidly Democratic portion, but even support amongst black people is declining compared to the Obama years. And you can do this by age. You can also, again, see where the ascendant coalition of Democrats is leaning. Democrats are leaning young, especially when it comes to young white people. You can see the only demographic of white people that Democrats won is young white people. Now, youth turnout was up, but up only to around 37%, which is good for a midterm, but compared to 46% turnout overall, still precipitously lower than turnout amongst older individuals. So you can see black people of all demographics, even though there is a dip around the millennial generation for black people. I don't think that's an accident. I think you can see the millennial generation because that's basically my age cohort. We graduated college through the Great Recession. We suffered through 8 years of Obama blowing smoke up our butts, but not doing anything for us. Pandemic hits, not really seeing any real relief. And you have an entire generation of black people who have seen the wealth decline because the house they were supposed to inherit has lost value because of the housing crisis. I just don't think it's an accident that it's particularly the millennial / exennial demographic of black people that is the lowest amount of support for the Democratic Party. Massive support amongst black elders, massive support around black youth, but a dip around Black Generation X and the black millennials. And again, this is the story we were being told around, look at the demographic mix of the voter base. The Gen Z is the lowest concentration of white voters, 56%. So the story that they've been telling us about politics in general is that we just got to wait for the old folk to die. It's getting more brown. It's getting younger. The white folk are woke now, and this is going to lead to a massive benefits for Black people and the Democratic Party. But this is where I want to begin to complicate today. This is from Nate Cohn. We went to the same college, Nate Cohn at the New York Times. He actually pointed out that the turnout gap between Black folk and white folk is the biggest turnout gap in recent history in 2022. So Obama years massively juiced up the turnout for Black people. Only a 2% turnout gap in 2008. Off-year elections, midterms, of course, it's going to be a turnout gap. But even still, it was moderated by enthusiasm for the Democratic Party. 2016, you can understand Trump's victory by seeing the turnout gap between Blacks and whites stay at midterm levels. This is the gap. This is the overall gap between Black turnout and white turnout, increasing in 2020. Very close election that Biden barely won, and just explodes to 26% lower for Black voters compared to white voters. Now, we saw turnout in general was up, but that means more white people are showing up. So this is important. As much as people say Black folk won democracy, the people who run, the smart people in the Democratic Party knows this number. And what they're saying is, what do I need Black people for? Why do I have to give them anything material? My meal ticket is white people in the suburbs, and they show out. They cared about Roe. Black people, some of them showed out. The suburbanites showed out. The middle class folks showed out. But the Black folks in the cities, they did not show out. And this is something I always point out. Every time we talk about Black turnout, you have to disaggregate by geographic area. So as we can see here, turnout within major Black cities. Philadelphia is about 50% Black, right? And this is Black turnout. Detroit, Wisconsin, Cleveland. Compared to the rest of the state, this is the bar you see. The top bar is the Black city. This is the bar underneath is the rest of the state. In every place but Ohio was above 2018 turnout. So turnout was up in critical areas of these states, but in the actual urban areas where Black people live, turnout was down, in some cases substantially down. That was a very competitive senator's race in Ohio with Tim Ryan going against J.D. Vance, the hillbilly elegy guy. And there was a about a 30% drop in turnout in Cleveland. Tim Ryan can't beat J.D. Vance. It's a 30% drop in Cleveland, right? So this is the reality that as much as we keep hearing about Black people showing up and showing out and voting harder and turning out, the numbers just don't bear that out. And so I always find it interesting that when you actually go into the data, that takes time to crunch. You can't have an intelligent elections take 2 days after the election. You actually understand that like working class and poor Black people are voting less. They're voting less than ever. Middle-class, college-educated Black people and above are voting more than ever. So we're seeing a divide in terms of when people talk about meeting the interests of the Black voter. If the Black voter is predominantly middle-class and college-educated, that's going to be a very different interest than the masses of Black people. So again, trying to understand this data because it's confusing, which is why I want to talk you all through it. Compared to 2020, every critical demographic for the Democratic Party, their vote share declined. So this is not turnout, this is vote share. So Republicans gained voters amongst voters of color with college degrees, voters of color without college degrees, white people with college degrees, and white people without college degrees. Republicans gained with every single one of those demographics in 2022 compared to 2018. So how do we understand that result? They didn't gain enough because in 2018, they got absolutely annihilated amongst those groups, right? So this is a reshuffling of American politics in 2018, where turnout amongst these white college-educated folks just skyrocketed. They already voted, but now they really voting, right? 60% to 72%, right? Compared to white non-college educated, 40% to 50%, right? So that's the critical demographic. It's like most college-educated white people vote, but now like they all vote. A lot of those people who vote are now voting Democrats, right? So even if you go back to 2018, historic turnout, once in a generation turnout, not seen since the 60s, the gap, white people turned out more. They had a higher increase in turnout than Black people did. So even at the highest point of Black turnout last year, white people still turned out more than them. So if I'm a Democratic Party consultant, I'm telling my politician, look, you want to do stuff for Black people, but it's these white people that got you elected. right? So we keep talking about just vote harder and the eventually Democratic Party will care about us. But the question is that if they're looking at the data and they're seeing, because in their minds they won this year. That's the important thing to remember. They won, even though they lost the House. They were successful. This strategy of going all in on Roe and not talking about economic issues worked for them. And who is that strategy for? White college educated women specifically, right? So this is important when we understand the Georgia data, right? So you can see here, this is how the runoff compared to the general election. So this is post runoff, which is again why we wait. You can see that certain parts of Georgia where Warnock won in the actual general in November, but he did not get over 50%. And certain parts became more red, especially the north west corridor, which is more rural. The Libertarian actually did really well in these northwestern territories during the general, but of course the Libertarian was not in the runoff. But see where Warnock does better. If you know anything about Atlanta, you know that South Atlanta is where the black people live, and the northern suburbs are where more the rich white people live. And he's doing even better in the northern white suburbs than he is in the southern black suburbs. Also, go a little bit to the east, Athens. Does anybody know what's in Athens? Anybody watch college football? That is the home of the Georgia Bulldogs. That is the home of the University of Georgia. And it's black, but it's not nearly as black as Atlanta is. It's far more white compared to Atlanta. And that's another one of those critical places that is shifting more blue in the runoff compared to the general for Warnock. So again, if you're a Democratic consultant, you're seeing lots of patches of blue. Many of these areas are largely black populations. So not to denigrate any of the work that folks are doing here in Georgia. Pushing these counties that are in southern Georgia that's more sparsely populated, that's important to remember, further blue. But when they look at the dense geographic populations around Athens, Atlanta, Savannah, Augusta, these places are going more blue. And the question is who? And how do we actually deal with what we're seeing in the other data, which is that working class and poor black people are still not turning out. Highly educated white folks and people of color in general are turning out more. And what does that mean for who has the clout within the Democratic Party? Again, look, these are the crossover counties. These are the counties that voted both for the white Republican governor in the general and for David Warnock. So as you can see, the city of Atlanta is right here. Almost all of these crossover counties, they voted both. This is counterintuitive. You're not supposed to do this in politics. Again, our politics are so divided. How could Stacey Abrams lose a precinct to the white Republican governor Kemp, but David Warnock still win it? And I think part of it is like when you have local issues, what are the local issues? Education, policing. You want a solid Republican hand on that tiller because in your mind, that protects your property value. When it comes to DC, you're scared of Georgia looking stupid and backward and racist to the rest of the country. And some of these people, as we're going to get to, depend on government money for their jobs, government subsidies, government grants. So they want the federal money spigot to stay open. They don't mind sending a Democrat to DC because they're going to keep the party going when it comes to federal investment. What they don't want is a Democrat necessarily forcing black people to go to their school district. or dealing with the public safety stuff that they like at a local level. So it's completely consistent in my mind that you will have a split ticket for these white suburban nights in northern Atlanta between voting for Kemp and against Stacey Abrams and for Warnock and against Herschel Walker. That got coded as black people not voting for Stacey Abrams. There was a slight decline between black male support for Democrats and black women support, but that's not really what the data shows is the core issue. Black men still overwhelmingly support the Democrats. We all know that. But it's the white folk in these suburbs, a lot of these more white northern suburbs, and they split their tickets between Kemp and Warnock. And that explains most of the difference. Okay. So going back to understand these northern Atlanta districts, right? So we can see a similar thing happening in these districts. This is the same districts, the same story in the New York Times. They voted more for Trump in 2016, and many of them flipped over to Biden in 2020, right? So you can see the shift, right? These were Trump districts, that became more for Biden. So this is again the story of how Biden won. It's a lot of these white suburbanites in places like Northern Atlanta flipping their votes, right? So we're seeing something very similar when it comes to Kemp and Abrams. So this is the same districts on that map, Northern Atlanta, that were purple. They voted more for Kemp. So this is the different splits in different districts. Some of them way more for Kemp, plus 24. Some of them less for Kemp, plus 2. But again, the majority of them also flipped and went for Warnock compared to Herschel Walker. So it's a very, very similar story to what we have seen in the Trump-Biden voter. The flipping from Trump to Biden voter. It's the same type of voter who flips from Kemp to Warnock, right? And again, these are white, middle-class suburbanites that are doing the most of this reality. So when they say, how can they vote for Warnock and not Stacey Abrams, this is your answer. This is the majority of your answer, right? It is black poor people staying home and black working class people staying home. That's the majority of the answer, actually, because they don't, for whatever reason you insert, I would say because they don't see material things coming from the Democratic Party, who talked only about cultural issues this cycle, to mobilize this white moderate base in the suburbs, right? But you can also say it is the white moderates in these northern suburbs splitting their tickets between Republicans and Democrats. So those are the two explanations I would use to explain why Warnock won and Stacey Abrams did not win. Yes, and as you can see, as we become more college educated, they universally go towards these places where Walker did worse than Kemp. So this is just a comparison of places in Georgia where, compared to how Walker did and Kemp did, the more educated you get, the more likely it is that Walker did worse than Kemp. Almost nowhere did Walker do better than Kemp. And again, you can see this map is a little confusing, but this is all compared to the 2020 map. So compared to the 2020 map, there are all these red arrows in the governor's race, so where there was a massive red shift towards Kemp compared to 2020. Remember, of course, Biden won Georgia in 2020. And again, these arrows look massive, but these are really tiny shifts. These are like 3-4% shifts that are massive when the race is so close. So these arrows look gigantic, but these shifts are a little bit smaller than I think these arrows make it look. But even though most of these people, again, Alpharetta, Duluth, Lawrenceville, Marietta, all northern suburbs, Emory's up there, if you know about Emory University, all shifted right towards Kemp. Many of them shifted left towards Warnock at the same time, right? So it's kind of nailing down that argument, right? So again, to kind of nail down kind of how this worked. So even though Warnock won, if you actually look at the General Assembly of Georgia, it didn't work out in terms of how they won it. So even beyond Stacey Abrams and Warnock, the Democrats are struggling at some points in Georgia after this redistricting. So just reading a little bit of quotes here, Democrats were hoping to gain the General Assembly after redistricting. Fair Districts Georgia, a group that opposes gerrymandering, projected Republicans had an advantage in 98 of the new state house districts. These are state house districts drawn by Republican majorities last year, or Democrats had the advantage in 82. Republicans, though, held or took over several districts drawn to favor Democrats. The longest serving member of the House, Republican Gerald Green, won a Southwest Georgia seat that leans Democrat. So this is, again, why we have to look down ticket, right? So this is the actual Georgia State House that after redistricting, of course, every 10 years, we take the census and we use the census data to do redistricting. They redraw this, not just the federal maps, but the state maps too. And the idea is that, well, we're going to put so much pressure on them. We're going to have a more fair redistricting process that's going to give the Democrats a shot to pick up slots in the Georgia State House, which is, again, what the Abrams people have been touting as part of downstream benefits of having people like Abrams run. That did not happen in 2022, right? So even though there was this big turnout for Warnock, they call it coattails. If you ever watch an old cartoon of Bugs Bunny, he got the old timey conductor's tuxedo coat on with the tails on it. You can and someone will stand on his coat and he'll drag him across the floor, right? So that's the coattails effect. So Warnock did not have long coattails, even though he beat or you could say Kemp did have coattails, right? Kemp beat Abrams by a substantial amount compared to how close Georgia typically is, and he carried other Republicans through with him. So that flip voter in the northern suburbs, which is so celebrated at a federal level, that flip voter in the northern Atlanta suburbs cost the Democrats the state house. And again, when you're talking about material advantages for Black people, they might be willing to send a Warnock to D.C. because D.C., they don't want the craziness of Herschel Walker making Georgia look bad. They don't want him having his malapropisms or his violence or his drama, but they still vote Republican down ticket, right? So we have the Democrats really lauding the victory of Warnock, and I think it does make sense to laud that victory in some ways if you're a Democrat. But think about the way in which they achieved that victory, which is so many of these white northern suburbanites flipping costs them the ability to do redistributive and social justice policy at a state level. So as opposed to designing a campaign, which many people think of Abrams' 2018 campaign from the bottom up, focusing more on local issues, it's focused on national issues, on Trump, on abortion, on DC, brought in the northern suburbanites who were willing to vote Warnock, but they still voted down ticket Republican, costing them the ability to win in redrawn, less gerrymandered districts at the state house level. So these are the real implications of the so-called pragmatic politics of the Democratic Party, right? Is that you might get a Warnock, but if it costs you seats you were supposed to win, these were seats drawn to have Democrats win them at the state level, and they still lost them, right? So these are just the trade-offs we have to take into account when Democrats tell you vote blue no matter who, we need to have the most electable candidate, we have to run the campaign that can get the swing voter. This is the cost of that. I hope folks in Black Power media, if anybody, understand the value of the cost of these sort of strategies, right? So just to understand, you don't have to read this quote, just to understand what's happening with politics today. There's a dynamic that they call calcification. There's a book called The Bitter End, John Slides, Chris Tessinovich, and Lynn Varek. So their book is about the 2020 election. It's salacious, it's more data driven, but the whole point is that something's happening with our politics where we're like a 50-50 divided nation. And sometimes that gets coded as nothing matters. It's going to be 50-50 no matter what, but you should think about it the other way around. If we're a 50-50 divided nation, the tiniest shifts matter a lot. And that's not to say vote hard or vote blue no matter who. That's to understand how political strategists are thinking about this. They don't care about mobilizing the tens of millions of Black people who don't vote every year. Many of them don't believe it's possible. They don't know how to do it. They've been trained not to care about that. They're more trained in the world of calcification to focus on the tiny sliver of people that they do know, who are like them, or who are within their networks, who are reachable, who are touchable, who they can flip. So when people keep saying, I don't get it, don't they understand that if they did Medicare for all or universal basic income, there'd be millions of people who never voted, they would show up to vote? Democrats are like, meh, giving them what they want would hurt my donors, and I don't believe they'll show up, and I don't have to get to them. We are so closely divided. If I can pick a narrow subset of people in this calcified environment and flip them, that's all I need. So that's why people are thinking about this the way they're thinking about it. It's that calcification doesn't mean nothing matters. Calcification means a tiny micro segment that flips between Democrat and Republican can mean everything. And that's what these people are trained to do. They're not trained to do broad-based political mobilization of the downtrodden and politically depressed and politically excluded. They're trained to micro-target strategic sections of people who they think are flippable, who are swing voters who are flippable. All right, and I'm actually going to read this because this is actually really important. This is from The Economist in 2018. It explains in great detail why these white suburbanites matter so much, right? So Donald Trump rearranged American politics by courting working class whites and alienating educated ones. That helped Republicans win the presidency. It should have hurt them in the House. But in 2016, the party got the best of both worlds because many conservative whites with degrees split their ticket. In states whose presidential winner was never in doubt, they chose Clinton. But perhaps because they expected her to win and wanted to check on her power, they backed House Republicans and they narrowly decided district. That changed in 2018. When educated whites abandoned the Republican House candidates because Democrats were already competitive in the suburbs, they needed only small swings. They won 13 of the 15 Republican-held districts where a majority of white voters had college degrees. That made the Democratic vote more efficient. In 2016, the party won 17 seats by single-digit margins. This time it took 40. And what about gerrymandering? While they sought to protect incumbents, Republicans did draw the boundaries of more districts than Democrats did. Remember, the party that controls the state house draws the districts of the legislative districts. Republicans dominated state houses because Obama really messed up in 2010 and disarmed his army of voters. So Republicans gerrymandered these districts. But going back to the article, they only ran the process in 37% of those states. Of the 42 seats the party lost, it had gerrymandered just 9. Those 9 seats, however, showed that extreme gerrymandering is risky. Many Republican mapmakers tried to neutralize Democratic voters by burying them in suburban districts full of educated whites. They never imagined that this ruse would backfire. But Mr. Trump drove these once loyal Republicans into Democratic arms. This is why the Democratic Party doesn't care about you. I want to make that as clear as possible. It's why they don't care about you. Because when it comes to a vote for the House of Representatives, if you are a black person, you likely live in a packed district. So they pack in Democratic votes in places where they already are sure Democratic victories. What they care about are people in cracked districts, right? Where typically they'll have these big swaths of the suburbs and little tiny pockets of the city where they're trying to make sure that the city folks don't get a Democratic representative. So they could try to mobilize votes in that little tiny sliver of the inner city. But it's like, why would I do that? I can go after all these, moderate, never Trump, Republicans who don't like Trump's ickiness in the suburbs, right? So in terms of winning the House of Representatives, winning critical House seats, which gets Democratic consultants paid, they would much, much rather target white suburbanites than black and brown people in the inner city, because the way these districts are drawn, oftentimes there's very tiny slivers of these black and brown cities in these districts, but wide swaths of suburbs. Also, if you conversely, sometimes they'll just make one big black brown city a whole district in itself, and they always get a Democratic representative, but that race is never competitive, so your vote don't matter unless it's a primary, right? So if you're cracked, you're not targeted, and if you're packed, you don't matter. So either way, Democrats in these big cities kind of don't matter, at least from the minds of many Democratic operatives, which they don't want to tell you, right? So look at this map. This is Detroit. Look at how they had the district drawn with the gerrymanders. This is how they gerrymandered the district in after 2010 census. So you can see here, they have a tiny, tiny sliver of Pontiac, but this massive, massive swaths of Highland, right? And you can see Detroit's all packed in. And when they keep Detroit all packed up, that's going to go blue. But they wanted to try to make this district, the Highland district, Michigan 11, go red by taking just a tiny, tiny sliver of like Pontiac and Troy, right? And ignoring all the rest of Detroit. So when you're like, why don't they do what they want, the people in Detroit want? It's like, I don't care what the people in Detroit want. That's going blue anyway. I want the people in Troy. I want the people in Highland, because they can flip this district blue. And what happened? In 2018, this is exactly what happened. This is that massive turnout we talked about. So Detroit, again, all that was going blue anyway, right? But slivers of Troy, a rich suburb, flipped to that never Trump, he got too much drama around him type of feel, and this place actually went blue. So again, if you're wondering why it seems like a losing strategy for Democrats to never target increasing turnout in Detroit, in their minds, what they know how to do is win these House seats. And then when you want to win a House seat, this is what you do. You target these swing areas. You don't necessarily target Detroit, because that's going to go blue anyway. So you have a lot of people trained in congressional elections thinking about Democratic politics, presidential politics, how they think about congressional seats, that's why swing voters matter so much, because they are typically dispersed within districts that have been gerrymandered to what they thought was a safe Republican gerrymander, and they can flip that district to a Democrat winning a House seat. That's totally different in presidential politics. Presidential politics is the whole state matters. But they don't know how to think that way, and they don't know how to make people in inner city Detroit turn out, right? They don't want to do the things that they would ask for, like, fundamental police reform at a federal level, to the extent that that's even possible. They don't want to do, like, reparations for slavery. They don't want to do broad-based investments in black cities that black elected officials can control, that black people know and trust and have voted for years, because that would undermine the power of the Democratic Party, right? And so, yeah, I'm probably cannibalizing a lot of the rest of this talk, but hopefully we'll make it go faster than it's going right now, because this is why I want you to understand. This is why I don't care about you, because in their mind, caring about you is political liability, and caring about these people as a political benefit. All right. Keeping it moving. All right, so again, white women. That's what it's all about. Every single demographic group for white people. College educated men, losing them more, 7%. Non-college educated women, 24% in the 2022 election. Non-college graduate men, 46%. They're losing them more and more every year. College educated white women, 2018 was the high water mark. 20% voted Democrat. And again, this is typically, think back to 2004, think back to John Kerry, George Bush, compassionate conservative. This was their dominant base. But different demographics of white women are going to college, and the Roe stuff and the Trump style has turned these people off. So this is the bread and butter of the base that delivered the victory, very much in quotes, victory, in 2022, but they did deliver victory in 2020. This is what brought Biden to the White House, is college-educated women. All right. Now I want you to think a little bit about this. Some of you probably understand this. Where do college-educated women work? So people are like, the Democrats don't give nothing to their base. The Republicans demand concessions to their base. Democrats don't demand anything. I want to push back against that just a little bit, because you got to understand who their base really is. If their base is white women, then where do white women work? Where do college-educated white women work? I argue that it's the nonprofit sector and that it's the government sector. And to that extent, the Democrats are delivering to their base, just not to you. Right? So let's look at the actual economics of the Democratic base, the nonprofit engine. $45 billion, 12 million employees in the nonprofit sector. 12 million people are employed in nonprofits in this country. Right? And anyone that worked in a nonprofit know a disproportionate percentage of those are white women. But let's understand how this works. This is a good book written by academic named Claire Dunning called Nonprofit Neighborhoods. And she explains the connection between the states and nonprofits. It's not like nonprofits are back in the day, where you had a rich dude or rich donors, they do a cookie drive, they pass the bucket. They are tied into the government. That's what neoliberalism is. It's the nonprofits doing what the state doesn't anymore, right? So I'll just read this quote. These financial ties and the broader governing relationship they embody can be hard to detect, and among historians have been underexplored, as they know where the American state met urban neighborhoods and citizens accessing certain democratic rights, including the right to participation, representation, and social welfare provision. Despite the fact that in the 21st century, nonprofits received more revenue from governments than from private donors, few know this to be true. The notion of an independent, charitable, voluntary realm remains one of the country's greatest myths, and obscures how intertwined government and nonprofit organizations have become, and why this has been so consequential for U.S. cities. The formal engagement of neighborhood-based nonprofits in urban governance constitutes one of the most profound, if hidden, transformations in the United States over the second half of the 20th century. This is why we have Build Back Better. This is why we have the American Rescue Plan. It is the Democrats giving pork to their base, and it's the white saviors. It's the white saviors, folks. It's the white saviors. This is what you got to understand. Like, it's not like they're not delivering to their base. Like, more than half of nonprofit revenue comes from the government. So when you need addiction services, who do you call? They're not getting rich people to run the rehab center. They're billing Medicaid, the Medicare, right? Social work, all these things are government intertwined. So again, why don't they do stuff for the black people in the cities? They are. They're giving money to the white saviors that live in the suburbs to do the work in the inner city. And so this is why we have to understand that this whole thing about the nonprofit industrial complex isn't just people like us talking about Becky's and how annoying they are. It is a political economic system that determines how voting and Democratic Party politics works in this country. It's not just about them being annoying. It's about them having an assemblage of power where they'd rather fund the nonprofits, because those are safe Democratic Party supporters who won't demand them to do things that their funders would dislike. Where if they went back to the model cities model and funded the cities directly, those voters might demand things like controlling the nature of economic development in their cities. The white folks aren't going to do that because many of them don't live in the cities. Or if they do, they have a vision of gentrification that goes in line with what real estate capital wants. You understand? So this is, again, why we have the policy we have. This is just more support for the argument. I'm not just blowing smoke here. Statistical studies have shown the nonprofit sector disproportionately has been deemed feminine work, and white women have disproportionately benefited from that coding. Similarly, the main metric of who works in the public sector is college education, and who's benefited the most from expansions in college education? White women. Even more than white men over the past 50 years of Title IX relative gender equity. Yes, when you control for everything else, white women are less likely to work in the public sector than black men or black women. But so many more white women have degrees, they still represent a disproportionately large percentage of public employees, right? So who is the Democratic Party giving money to? Cities, counties, states, and nonprofits. That's just Democratic Party pork barrel spending, right? I want you to look at this. I think this is sneaky. Because again, look at the ARPA, American Rescue Plan Act. Like, people in Baltimore are, fighting hand over glove if nonprofits get access to this money. And this was what they did to repair the harm of the pandemic. But it was a money bomb. They just dropped a money bomb directly to cities and state governments, right? $200 billion for states in the District of Columbia, $130 billion for cities and counties. But look at the fine print. Eligible uses now include a provision for lost revenue and must be used by December 31st, 2024. What happens in 2024? The next presidential election. So they're not going to give you the bag and let you keep the bag. They're not going to refill the bag every year. They're going to make you show up and basically say, look, if you want to keep getting a new bag in 2025, you need to vote for my man. You need to make sure Democrats stay in power. So this is not like a perpetual entitlement. This is a one-shot deal where you have to ladle that out over 4 years. And if you want another bite at the apple, if you want another shot for us to get a money bomb on your city or your state, you as a Democratic Party, nonprofit leaders, state leaders, gotta make sure Biden stays in office or the Democrats stay in power, because we control the money machine. And the only way we crack open that safe is if we are in power. Because Republicans not gonna give you nothing. They may give you some stuff here for 12-step and conservative, philanthropy, conservative services, and they may fund some of that, but they're not going to do this. And this is being sold to us as reparations, as liberation, as everything. And it may be useful, it may be necessary, but it's definitely pork. It's definitely politics. It's definitely political. And it definitely expires. Right? These are just some of the dynamics at play, right? So I'm going to skip over some of this stuff. This is just, that was just analysis saying that the Democratic Party was afraid they were going to lose this election. But they chose to not focus on kitchen table issues around inflation because they had no plan that would not piss off their donors. They chose to double down on suburban whites who were not feeling as much of a pinch from inflation, and it worked, and focusing on the abortion issue, right? But I want to set this up. I want to set up in terms of what is the policy implications of the Democratic Party focus on college-educated voters so much. So I don't like Malcolm Gladwell. I'm not the biggest fan of his, but I think he is right in terms of his trollish pointing out of interesting facts. He stumbled upon something useful, which is that these universities, these Ivy League elite universities, have so much money, they don't even need to collect tuition. They could literally fund the entire university without charging a single person a dime of tuition. They're basically giant investment firms with a school attached to them, right? So, short version, universities fund their operations largely through three sources of income: government grants, student tuition, and distributions from their endowment. The proportion drawn from each of those three buckets varies greatly from school to school. If you're a school that does a great job of funding federal research grants like Hopkins, then the first bucket counts for a lot. If your elite school takes in a lot of full tuition rich kids, like, say, Washington University of St. Louis, then the second bucket counts for lots. The third bucket is tricky. The purpose of an endowment is to subsidize the university's annual budget, but nobody wants to dip into the principal unless it's absolutely necessary. So standard practice is to divide the annual return from the endowment into two parts, returning one portion to the principal so the endowment keeps growing and using the rest to supplement the annual operating budget. But that is now until the leafy Gothic cradle of financial alchemy known as Princeton. After a stellar year in 2021, Princeton University has an endowment of $37 billion with a B. $37 billion. Over the past 20 years, the average annual return for the endowment has been 11%. Look at your 401k. Look at your Acorn portfolio. I bet you they're not doing 11%. God, I hope you don't look at your crypto. Let's give person the benefit of the doubt and assume that at least some of what was luck and maybe unsustainable, it's a more reasonable prediction going forward. It's like an average return of 10% per year. That return is $7 billion. I'm skipping around. I'm setting this up. We're going to use some of this math later in a different analogy that will be useful. Now, what is, for instance, annual operating budget? $1.8 billion. The arithmetic here is not hard. $3.77 billion in investment income minus $1.86 billion in operating expenses leaves you with $1.91 billion. Person can let in every student for free. University administrators could tell the U.S. government and all of its funding agencies, it's cool, we got this. They could take out the cash registers in cafeteria, hand out free parking to all visitors, give away Princeton sweatshirts on Nassau Street, fire the entire accounts receivable staff and their entire fundraising staff tomorrow. They could say to every one of the hardworking professors on their staff, you never have to spend even a second writing a grant proposal again, free at last, free at last. So he's being a bit of a troll. This is his style, but he's right. There's a sliver, not all, but a sliver of elite universities that have benefited from 10 years straight of economic expansion. They contracted a little bit in 2022, but they still have so much more money than they use to operate the university that they should be understood more as reservoirs for wealth, tax shelters that have a school attached to them, more than educational institutions needing federal subsidy. And the one thing Trump did, this is where we start to get into politics again. Trump, because he wanted to give more tax breaks to his friends are not at Stanford. His friends are not at the Ivy Leagues. So he actually put in a small tax on elite universities with massively disproportionate endowments, right? So Stanford, for example, would have a $43 billion tax bill under the Trump tax, and it would raise in aggregate $200 million. Not a huge sum of money. It was Trump playing some of his cultural politics games. The woke universities have to pay their fair share, but he's actually giving the tax break to like jet ski salesmen in Tampa or some bullshit like that, right? So it's just Trump being a troll, but it's still $200 million that if a actual legitimate politician wanted to use that money for something, they could invest that in, again, black cities, the places where they don't care about investing in increasing turnout, technical training for people who don't go to Princeton, right? But what is Princeton doing? The Ivy Leagues are trying to get this tax cut eliminated because, of course, they are, right? So here we have the Democratic Party, of course, supporting the efforts of entities like this to get a tax break. Ivy League, multi-billion-dollar entities compared to actually using the money. It's like, well, how about we actually just use the money for something good as opposed to jet ski salesmen in Tampa? That's not what the Democratic Party is. That's not where they need to be. Because the people that put them in power are white, educated women in the suburbs who hate the idea of universities paying taxes because these are the cathedrals of learning, right? These are sacred, hallowed institutions, right? So this is how you have to understand how you can have a Democratic Party that is somehow anti taxing the rich, because it's taxing the wrong rich and taxing them in the wrong ways, right? Another thing to understand is, again, while they are giving massive tax breaks to giant multi-billion-dollar universities, student loan relief that Biden did, which juiced up youth turnout, likely to be overturned. And it's partially going to be overturned because he used very, very, very shaky legal grounds to ground this student debt relief. You can look into this in more podcasts, but it's very well documented. They used a particular provision of pandemic relief that doesn't really talk about student loan debt as the justification for doing the student debt erasure, as opposed to just citing the student loan law, which would have been far stronger legally. And some people are even saying, well, they don't seem to mind. They may even like that it's overturned because then they can use it as a turnout move for 2024. And again, these are the games. Pusha T said, these are the games we play. These are the names we say, right? Like, this is the reality of, if you're trying to motivate a college-educated base, give them student debt relief, have the courts take it away, and then say, hey, can't do nothing about it. We got to flood these courts with Democrats. If you want to do that, you got to vote for me in 2024. Same deal. Cities, states, I got the bag. I control the Federal Reserve. If you want the money to come to you and not just ski dealers in Tampa, you got to vote for the Democrats. So it's not just vote blue no matter who. It is, I'm going to signal to very narrow people who are in my core demographic that I will materially provide for their interests. It's just not you, right? And the results of 2022 lead me to believe they are doubling down on this strategy and on this rhetoric in terms of narrowcasting, essentially narrowcasting particular political messages and benefits to the most strategically important demographics who will not ask them to do broad-scale redistributive policy that pisses off their donors. In 2022, being coded as a victory despite losing the House shows me that they're really committed to doing this, right? I just want you to understand the implications of this politics, right? Another implication. Yeah, about 15 more minutes, then we'll do Q&A. Many of you will know about the Reagan strike busting. Air traffic controllers, they were seen as a strategically powerful union. Planes will crash if they don't give us what we want, they thought. And Reagan was like, nah, you can go on strike. I'll bring in scabs. I don't care if the planes crash. And he busted the union. He made them concede to the demands of the Capitol, their bosses. I walked by the air traffic controller's office in D.C. It's like a frumpy office, like a mile away from the Capitol. So D.C. Capitol hegemony, social capital works in terms of proximity to the White House and the Capitol building. And so the air traffic controllers union being so far away from the Capitol, that's like showing the body after you murder somebody to deter the other people from doing what they did. Like that's like a flex almost. It's like, yeah, you thought you was high, but look at you now. You stuck. You stuck all the way, 2 miles away from downtown. Yeah, man. What just happened just a couple weeks ago. Biden, supposedly the most pro-union candidate since FDR, signed a bill to forcibly eliminate the leverage of rail workers and end their strike. I'm sure folks have been talking about this, but understand this through the lens of the political results I've been telling you. If your demographics are college-educated white people, you don't mind taking the legs out of the white working class, the multicultural working class. I'm sure that my brother used to work on the trains, right? So how you understand these dynamics isn't just they're stupid. They're not stupid. They know exactly what they're doing. And they understand that if Becky in the suburbs cannot get her kombucha because her Amazon delivery did not come on time, that's more of a fear to them than Cletus in West Virginia, who is in a congressional district that's not competitive, being mad because he can't afford to go to the doctor because he has no paid sick leave, working on the trains. This is a political calculation by the Democratic Party. And this data I'm giving you helps you understand why that calculation was made. Right? So similarly, Democrats we support labor. We love unions. Unions like the New York Times union. So this is one thing we're seeing. We're seeing an increase in labor militancy. We're seeing an increase in labor militancy amongst whom? Some of them are working class, some of them are industrial workers, and they tend to meet a much harder road to hoe than the labor militancy amongst college-educated workers. Not just the New York Times, but also, all these journalistic entities, but also like Starbucks. A huge percentage of Starbucks employees are college-educated now, and they serve a college-educated clientele that's just not going to mind if their latte goes from $7 to $8, if they can afford it to feel like a good person and to not feel like a scab. So if you're dealing with a particular industry where college-educated people live and consume, I think you're pretty likely to get some labor support from the Democratic Party because you're not essential to the economic functioning of America. Like the New York Times is not essential to the economic functioning of America. I mean, you could argue Starbucks, right? But people could just go to Dunkin'. They'd hate it, but they could go, right? You can get coffee. But the trains, oh no, can't deal with the trains. Break their strike. Not even break that strike with sick leave. Break the strike, right? Because at the end of the day, you still serve capital. And where do the people who work in finance capital live? A lot of them live in the suburbs. A lot of them are donors to the Democrats. A lot of them particularly care about cultural issues like gay rights and abortion, but they work in Wall Street. They don't want to see sick leave being put into the railroad workers because the entire profit model of the railroads is working spectacularly well, mandates they don't have sick leave. right? So it's not the Democratic Party working against our interests. They're working pretty effectively in their interest. You just have to understand what their interests actually are and who their base actually is. So what do our prestigious leaders tell us to do about this dynamic? Even Max Kendi, he actually has a Center for Anti-Racism at Boston University. And one thing, his group released a webinar and an infographic talking about the other swing voters. So these are young people, they argue, who swing between voting and for Democrats and not voting at all. And he's saying that we should counter the power of the Republican to Democrat swing voter with the voter, non-voter swing voter, particularly young POC. And this is his demographic. Again, I always vote for the Democrats, 30%. Democrat, Republicans, 33%. This is, I believe, young people. Always vote Republican, 18%. I choose between Republican Party or not voting, 7%. Choose between Democratic Party and not voting, 8%. So as opposed to focusing on Democrat, Republican, which is a much bigger chunk of the electorate, which again, it's like you could talk about populist economic issues that people care about. They're essentially irredeemable to a lot of people in the academic world. So focus on Democratic Party and not voting, right? Or voting third party, which is 8%, which again, it's like 8% is not nothing. We are living in a calcified environment. What do we know though? What did we learn today? Is that POC are disproportionately cracked and packed when it comes to presidential politics. And also, you can deal with some of those swing state dynamics. There are a lot of POC in swing states, but a lot of those POC are who are not voting, who are not in the always vote for the Democratic Party, which is frankly most of Kendi's demographics. Always vote Democrat. A lot of those folks who choose between third party and not voting are working class, lower class, and they are looking for an agenda that meets their material needs for jobs they could actually get, good jobs like working on a railroad that you don't need a college degree for. But what does Kendi give us, right? These are the types of things that Kendi's group presents as the political basis for this new swing voter, Roe v. Wade and January 6th, right? And he's like, look at the support amongst this new swing voter for being anti-January 6th and pro-Roe v. Wade. And it's like, yeah, you're describing a Democrat. And you're not describing anything materially that can drive poor working class people that they can see that as materially in their interests. So as opposed to changing the swing voter dynamic, he's actually just proving their argument, which is like, I can get those people, your swing vote 8%, I can get them with Roe, great. Break the railroad strike. Crush the union, right? Because they don't care about that. You told me they don't care about that. You told me they care about Roe, Kendi. So this is the problem, is that we have academic elites and institutions designed to do the politics who are actually feeding into the assumptive logic of the neoliberal Democratic Party, even if they claim to be pushing against it. I'm sure Kendi and his people would claim to be pushing against it, but if we actually understand the dynamics of what they're presenting, they're not presenting an actual populist working class agenda that can push back against the concentration of wealth and power into elite hands. Okay, actually, yeah, we're doing a little bit better on time than I thought. We are wrapping up here. A few more slides left. So what do we know? We know that there's going to be huge changes in the Democratic Party in 2024. It's not official yet. We're looking at a massive shift in the nomination of how we get to be president. So we don't know if Biden will face a challenge to be a Democratic nominee in 2024. We don't know if Biden's going to run in 2024. What we do know is that Biden and his ilk have put in a proposal to change the nomination process for how a Democratic nominee gets selected in 2024. I'm sure folks have been talking about this. We know what are the first two states, the most powerful political states in the world when it comes to American politics are Iowa and New Hampshire. Iowa and New Hampshire. If you know anything about presidential politics, it all flows through Iowa. Obama famously won Iowa, defeated Hillary Clinton, was the springboard to the presidency. Bernie Sanders, 2016, famously destroyed Martin O'Malley, annihilated Martin O'Malley into his political career, nearly beat Hillary Clinton, possibly did, depending on your view of how rigged that primary was, and catapulted himself into a political mainstream. Pete Buttigieg had a massive scandal where, despite Sanders getting more votes in 2020, shenanigans about how the votes were translated into caucus points essentially meant that Pete Buttigieg was declared the winner. And partially because of that scandal, and mostly because it's just super white and they hated Biden, and they did not like Kamala Harris. Iowa is on the political shit list of the Democratic Party right now. Iowa is going to likely lose their first in nation caucus status. And who do they want to give it to? South Carolina. Who made Joe Biden's political career? Who saved his political career? Clyburn in South Carolina. So now they want South Carolina to go first. They still are likely to give New Hampshire a ceremonial slot very early in the proceedings of the primary caucus, primary process. But then they want to go to Nevada. So they're going to do black vote, white vote in New Hampshire, Latino vote in Nevada, and then they're going to do big state vote. And who are the big states? Michigan and Georgia. So these are not just states likely to vote for Biden. These are states noted to be strongly tied to the political machines. Michigan, obviously more diverse. Politically, voted for Bernie in 2016 famously. Big multicultural state. So I think bumping Michigan up probably good, right? But making South Carolina first is kind of accident. South Carolina is one of the most conservative Democratic parties in the country. Not just conservative, but institutionally tied. The institutional mainstream Democratic Party has deep ties in the South Carolina Democratic Party. So whether it's Biden or Kamala Harris, people are saying they likely have a huge leg up in South Carolina because that's a machine Democratic Party state. You know, it's obviously it's harder here for South Carolina Democrat. I understand aligning with the mainstream Democratic Party when you're facing Republicans all the time. That's a political choice people make. We could talk about some of the nuances of that choice and some of the rhetoric the burning people had around criticizing that choice. But it benefits Biden, and it benefits Harris, and it benefits mainstream conservative institutional Democrats going forward, right? So I wanted to leave with I'm not going to read that, but I'm just going to propose to you an alternative strategy because I didn't want to leave without something about what do we do. I'm not going to say what do we do. I'm going to present to you a thought exercise in terms of how do we push back against the hegemony of the Democratic Party, closing down our space to think radical thoughts about how we pursue liberatory politics for Black people in the future. So I'm going to go here. There's actually an article about how they lost money, but if you go down to the bottom, I should have highlighted it. This says that U.S. foundations, like philanthropic foundations, just like those universities we talked about earlier, have 1.3 trillion with a T. They have $1.3 trillion that they manage in assets from down by 200 billion in 2021. 1.3 trillion dollars tax-free in a tax shelter. So when we talk about redistributing the GDP, I'm saying we have to strategically target portions of the GDP that gives us the most political leverage to go after them. And just how Trump went after the elite institutions because they were woke and they were producing these annoying people with pink hair, and gave the money, taxing them to give to us, a professional fisherman in Boca Raton. We need to think strategically about targeting pots of money that we can say, how can you not tax that? That's money that should be going to the people through taxation. Because say what you will about your local political elected official, they're more democratically responsive by definition than the head of any major foundation. You cannot vote out the head of the Ford Foundation. You can vote out your annoying city council person. You can vote out your mayor. You cannot vote out the head of, Gates Foundation. You cannot vote out Bill Gates. So this is the reality of concentration of wealth and power. So what would it look like? Thought experiment. What would it look like if we had the philanthropic interest tax? Not even taxing the principal. We talked about this with the universities. They have their principal endowment and they invest that principal and they produce returns by investing in the market through interest returns. So I'm going to be conservative. I'm going to try to be as conservative as possible with these numbers. Let's just say it goes down to 1.2 trillion. And that's a fathomably large number. Let's say they have 5% return ROI, return on investment. So not even the economy's bad. Let's chop it from 11% like Princeton had to 5%. That's $60 billion a year. That's such an unfathomably large amount of money. It's almost sickening. In interest, not even the principals. I'm not even saying I want to gobble up the foundation and give it to the people. I'm saying pay your fair share on the profit you make through investing interest. Tax it. What's a solid wealth tax? Some would say a solid wealth tax would be 90%. I'm not going to be that mean. I'm going to say 20%. So times 0.2, that's $12 billion. $12 billion. And how divvy it up, federal government, block grants. Go back to the model cities model. That's what that long block quote was. Go back to model cities, invest directly in the cities, but do it perpetually. Do it year over year so we don't have to sell out to you every time that you hold us over a barrel for a political election saying if you don't mobilize your base to turn out votes for me, the president, you won't get any money. 50 states, 50 biggest cities, 120 million a year per state and or city. 120 million. What can your city do with 120 million? It's not going to solve everything. But this is a good, what we call this is a good start. 120 million per year forever in your city that's tied to a model cities model of community control. That's what we call a good start. That's what we call money that has more lowercase d democratic control. See, and what they're going to give you is the opposite. Here's what they're going to tell you, and this is the end of the talk. They're going to say foundations do good work, but they could do better at listening to the people. So as opposed to having the foundation give out 5% of their annual income, we're going to have the foundation give out 6 or 7% of their annual income, or faith taxation. So who gets money from foundations? Lots of people, but largely people who are tied to people who work at foundations like. Who work at foundations? Highly educated people with college degrees. Who do they tend to fund? Increasingly multicultural, diverse in terms of race, sexual orientation, but largely highly educated people with college degrees who run organizations who do work largely for people who are not highly educated and don't have college degrees. So this is that you're going to demand lowercase d democratic control. What they're going to give you is increased funding. They're going to give you a concession. They're going to give you some sort of threat of litigation against foundations, but it will end up increasing capital D Democratic Party control. It's just going to put more money into the pockets of their base, which are increasingly gentrifiers and highly educated people in the suburbs in these swing districts. Well, they don't care how the money flow, but it's like the Spice and Dune, like the money will flow when it comes to the core of the Democratic Party's base today, which the 2022 midterms tells us are college-educated white women, college-educated people in general, and they are strategically targeting those folks with investments in state governments, local governments, and nonprofit institutions that are not designed for community control or broad-based Democratic Party control, broad-based Democratic control of the populace, and they're not focused on redistributive politics to working-class people because they don't think they need to be to win elections. And 2022 will be interpreted by them as proof of that concept. So that is it to say. That is my analysis of the 2022 midterms. And with the time we have left, I wanted to open myself up for a few questions.
Thanks, Lawrence. I just want to remind people that are viewing tonight's broadcast that we are live. So I've seen a lot of people in the comments kind of throw in their commentary. Really appreciate y'all for really keeping the chat really lively this evening here on Black Power Media. We really appreciate it. If you're just joining us not too long ago, you just caught the tail end of Lawrence Grandpre, who is the Director of Research for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, giving his analysis of the 2022 midterms. I see a few questions in the chat, and we're going to pull them up right now. So we have a user here that's asking the question, do Black people need to ramp up their participation in order to create a competitive narrative that motivates the Democrats to become responsive to poor Black people? And also, will Democrats remain incrementalists?
Yeah, I mean, that's the critical question. I mean, we really have to push back against their attempts to narrow our political vision of possibility. It's not easy because, again, they always use the suffering of our community essentially as political blackmail or political white mail, depending on how you feel about that term. Because people do have very real material needs every day. And nonprofits and these ARPA money does meet some of those material needs. The question I always ask people is, could we meet those needs better? Do we have to use the existing infrastructure to meet those needs? Or could you just invest in more diverse political service infrastructures to meet those needs? So what we have to do is we have to build from the bottom up with local money, with philanthropic money, with self-raised money, competitive Black community networks that meet our needs. And we need to demand as a condition for our vote that the politicians invest in those networks. So again, we can't do it all just off of Black community dollar circulation and Black capitalism or even Black philanthropy. the taxation is the reservoir of the collective accumulated stolen wealth of America. When the guy asks why did he rob the banks, what did he say? That's where the money is. Why do I talk about redistributive policy? Why do I talk about the Democratic Party? Why do I talk about voting? Because that's where the money is. And we need to be strategic. Is that if they're going to use our votes to use our suffering and empower people who are antagonistic to our sovereignty and meeting our needs genuinely, if they're going to use our votes to give more money and power to those people, that's actually against our interest. So we have to be willing to say, it's like what you're calling a positive, I'm calling a negative, and I'm actually willing to push back against that and organize around you, despite you claiming that this is the only way that we can survive, to do a form of survival that's actually worth calling survival and have the possibility of doing not just surviving, but thriving. So I think that's what we're doing here in Baltimore. We're working on things like using taxation of cannabis revenues from sales of cannabis in Maryland to actually invest in the communities most impacted by the war on drugs, but from a more grassroots community control perspective. So not just putting money back into the hands of the Democratic base, the white nonprofit industrial complex that claim to be addressing our suffering, which I think unfortunately has been what's happened in most states that legalize cannabis. It's just the natural gravity of those networks sucks up that cash. When you talk about reparations, we're talking about people who were like in jail for selling weed. They're not going to have a 501c3. They're probably not going to have 3 years of audit statements. They're not going to have insurance for working with kids. But you can get them that if you wanted to. If you built an institution that actually cared about meeting the needs of the community, you could demand, if this institution is not doing that, don't legalize weed. If you cannot guarantee me that you're going to give money to an institution that's going to do what I just said, I will tell my representative vote against cannabis legalization. And that's a hard thing to do because, yeah, people are going to jail. It sucks. But what we know is people still go to jail after legalization. That's the unfortunate reality that we know. So are we willing to actually stand up for our community and take stances like, look, if you're not going to do real reparations, not the BS they did in Illinois, don't vote for cannabis legalization. Try again next year. And we've done that. And when you're getting a grant to produce a political victory, it's hard to do that. But when you're actually powered by your own principles and you're powered by the community, you don't have to go to your donor and say, I delivered a political victory, even if the political victory isn't worth calling a victory. You can just say, try again. And if you have enough support from the community, they'll understand that even though the material benefits have been delayed, the value of actually having institutional investment that builds sovereignty and meets needs more concretely and holistically is worth the wait. But that's long-term organizing that builds trust in community, that allows you to do what we're trying to do here in Maryland, which is, again, use those tax revenues from legalized cannabis to actually do something worth calling reparations with that tax revenue. Because not just investment, because what we've seen with this talk, investment is a double-edged sword at best. And it's definitely feeding the political basis of the people who are in many ways antagonistic to our sovereignty at worst. But reparations means the people who are actually aggrieved are empowered to choose for themselves the mechanism of redress. And when you start talking about things like that, the Democratic Party starts getting skittish. Because that's not the dominant mode of the Democratic Party right now. It's much more top-down, nonprofit, ARPA, just sort of a vision of control where technocratic elites know what's best for the community and they empower the people who they know and they like to do it the way they like it. So I hope that answers your question. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy to push that politics to a larger federal level. But that's one thing we have to be willing, is we have to be willing to say no. And that's one thing Republicans are. Republicans are willing to say no. They're not facing the degrees of material deprivation that we are, at least not most of them. Some of them are very poor. But they're willing to say no. They're willing to stand on their principles, and they're willing to push back against the Republican base in the way that many of our elected Democrats especially have not been willing to. And they're only going to do it if we force them.
Thanks for the thoughtful response, Lawrence. If you're just watching us, this is Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle here with our podcast, In Search of Black Power, our show here on Black Power Media. Really happy to be here with the folks watching us tonight here at 7:30 at night. Want to make sure that we give time for more questions. We have a little bit more time for a couple more questions. But I want to remind people, if you're watching us here live or if you're listening to us on the podcast, that you can support this show by becoming a sustainer for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Just similar in the same way that you support Black Power Media. If you want to support our political organization working on behalf of the Black community here in Maryland, you can sign up on our website, scrolling across the bottom, lbsbaltimore.com /sustain. All right. So we have another user here asking us a question here. Shout out to them for being Sounds of State Elsewhere, for being a member of Black Power Media. The question is a continuance from your response, Lawrence. Does what you just said basically mean autonomously established and administer Black social institutions, but funded by state and federal government?
Yeah, I mean, I'm blanking on his name right now, but the guy who wrote the book about Black anarchism, I think he does a really good job as a Black anarchist saying that, like, you need to use politics to leverage the space for Black freedom, even as you take public money. Because the question is not, is taking public money good for Black autonomy? The answer is obviously no. The question is, of the possible avenues of addressing Black suffering at scale, which produces more possibility for Black people to exercise self-determination. And that means you're looking at money in the Black community, you're looking at corporate donations, you're looking at foundations, and you're looking at government money. Now, probably going to be some combination of everything, right? But money in the Black community, and what do we know from Dr. Jared Ball's work? We just don't have enough of it to meet our needs at scale. It doesn't mean you shouldn't have entirely self-funded Black community ventures. You know, education sessions, reading groups. You don't want to be taking foundation money for radical reading groups, right? But in terms of like 100,000 people are dying of overdose in America. How do we solve the addiction crisis at scale? We're going to need a lot of money for like very expensive drugs sometimes, but also very, very delicate treatment that requires high degrees of specialization. We have to build like institutional infrastructures of care. So the question is, who best deals with those infrastructures of care? Not the market. The market's exploitative and cycles money up to greedy capitalists. We can't depend on, you know, white philanthropy to choose to give us the autonomous community institutional infrastructure we need to address issues like addiction. So that means that as problematic as public money is, and there are lots of strings attached to it and it's very limited, we can use our votes and our political organizing in the streets to demand those strings be taken off. And what I would say is that even if it means you're taking less money than you otherwise might, or if they're offering you $1 billion, if they have all the strings attached, it's just like, no, it's like, give me 100 million, let me do what I want. And that's going to be the types of political concessions that we may have to make in order to push political sovereignty in a system not designed to give us space for that sovereignty. And it's going to have to come with a level of political organizing, which is more akin to what happened in the 60s and 70s. Like a lot of our work here in Baltimore is inspired by our Black elders in the 60s and 70s who come out of the Black power movements, and particularly things like the poverty programs, the model cities movement. So not like the Gary convention, you know, drumming dashikis. That wasn't all Black power was. Black power was the effort after the Voting Rights Act was passed of establishing political infrastructure in Black communities that met people's needs. And we have a legacy here of people like Walter Carter running our model cities program in a way that built political autonomy and control by the community into that program. And that was, of course, viciously attacked by people like William Donald Schaefer. So what I'm saying is that as we build out these new infrastructures, be it ARPA money, be it my model of foundation and interest taxation, be it opioid settlement money, check your local listings. These settlements of opioid distributors are massive. Who is getting that money? What I'm saying is that every opportunity be as strategic as possible for you to push back against the assumptive logic that you just have to take whatever they give you. And they don't have the right to become fat and happy and rich off of the suffering of our community. We have to fight to demand that these people who've stolen all this money through taxation, through opioid capitalism, and now are forced to redistribute a tiny portion of it through legal settlements of tort cases brought by states and cities. We have to fight for every possibility of controlling every dollar that comes through that in an organized and strategic way. And so that's going to mean, you know, being willing to engage electoral politics. Is going to be willing to disengage electoral politics, even when they say vote blue no matter who. We need to put all these tools on the table because these are the tools that are going to pry open more space for us to use the actual power we have through the vote and collective organizing to push back against the ways in which they seek to use this public money as a tool to control our communities.
All right, thanks again for that, Lawrence. All right, so we're going to wrap up. We're right here at the 7:30 mark here for In Search of Black Power on the 2022 midterm elections. Want to give Lawrence one final opportunity to give send us out this evening. But before we go, I wanted to remind folks, if you are a huge fan of In Search of Black Power, I've been seeing a lot of folks on the stream whose names I am real familiar with when we look at our broadcast, who are super fans of In Search of Black Power. Shout out to all of y'all for supporting Black Power Media and supporting the show. We've had a great time producing it over the last 6, 7, 8 months. And we look forward to bringing you more content in 2023. If you are a fan of the show, we have a treat coming for you soon. We're gonna be putting up some of our older In Search of Black Power episodes before we came to Black Power Media. They'll be presented in audio form here on the channel. But if you don't want to wait that long, you can actually just go to your favorite podcast streamer, whether it be Apple Podcasts, if you want to use Spotify, Google Podcasts, and just search In Search of Black Power. And you'll come across all of our archived episodes that we've been putting up, I believe, since 2018. And so we really appreciate your support for the show. And again, if you want to support Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, the group that powers this podcast and all of Lawrence's fantastic work, just go to lbsbaltimore.com/sustain. But yes, I want to give Lawrence a final word before we get out tonight.
Yeah, so I want to say thank you to everyone. This was definitely something that we had to stop the audio podcast during the pandemic, didn't have access to recording space. And as many of you know, every law in the state of Maryland is passed from January to April. And part of the benefit of us doing this work the way we do it is that we're not just here saying things. The theories we present here in the Search of Black Power, we are testing them and trying them in our work as a grassroots think tank, moving policy, doing community organizing, and that tends to be very intensive. So right now, through January through April, we're going to go back and re-release on YouTube the audio podcast that we did in 2017, 2018. This was like the first iteration of In Search of Black Power. It's designed to be like a Black This American Life. So it's definitely designed to be audio centered with like sound effects and like, conversational, but still scripted, having these elements of, high audio production, which was, again, sort of my first love was the audio side. And we wanted to not just have those buried on Stitcher and Spotify in the bottom of, the podcast. We really share that with the YouTube audience that we've cultivated here over the past year. And we're going to continue to innovate. We're going to continue to play with the model and continue to make sure we have time to bring you the best content possible. So we're probably going to have some changes when we come back to actual recording in April. And so we hope that you all continue to come along with us. We want to thank you for coming along with us this far and want to continue to go in search of Black Power. So thank you. Happy New Year. Happy Kwanzaa. And look forward to keeping this going.